So I want to welcome everybody to our diversity and inclusion speaker talk of a discussion of the Black experience in the American educational system. I want to thank our co-sponsors. So it is being co-sponsored by by CHESS, by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and by SINS, by the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, of which the graduate program in diversity and inclusion is under this Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. So I want to thank both the program and the departments and CHESS for sponsoring us. For just a moment, I want to read Brian Fuller's credentials. So Brian Fuller, M.Ed, is an educational leader and strategist with a passion for addressing the needs of historically underserved students. Hailing from Sumter, South Carolina, Brian's early experiences propelled him to be a fierce advocate for developing systems that create equity, opportunity, and agency for all students. His forthcoming memoir of his experiences as a Black male in the public education system sheds light on the importance of racially conscious teaching policies and practices for all students, especially Black and Brown children. A graduate of Harvard and Emory, Mr. Fuller holds a Master of Education in School Leadership and Development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and is the recipient of the 2016 Harvard Graduate School Leadership Institute Fellow. He currently serves as a freelance consultant in expert strategy and equity for the Boston nonprofit LearnLaunch Institute. In his career, Mr. Fuller launched the Philadelphia youth development nonprofit, the DREAM program, taught third grade at a charter school in New York City, and worked on the New York City Community Schools Initiative, served as chief of staff to multiple senior leaders at the New York City Department of Education, including as chief strategy officer overseeing school planning and development at the New York City Department of Education, implementing initiatives to empower communities in the creation of schools that positively impact New York City's 1.1 million students. And so our discussion tonight, Brian Fuller will read for us a little from his forthcoming book, The Foundation is Broken, Being Black in America's Schools is the story of a young Black man's journey through a broken educational system that does not place enough value on Black children. The memoir asks tough, bold questions about the structures of our educational systems and shines a critical light on the ideals of success that many Americans hold dear. Intense, heartbreaking, inspiring, and courageous, this memoir will encourage you to reimagine a better future for our educational system in this country to ensure a better future for our children. And so I am going to do the spotlight thing, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian to take it from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. That was a mouthful, hearing all of that, but I appreciate you sharing a little bit about my background and also sharing a little bit about my forthcoming memoir. And so as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, I wanted just to kick us off here with sharing a couple of excerpts from my book. And so we'll do that. And then from there, we'll go into, I think, like a Q&A panel discussion. And so the first excerpt that I want to read for you all today comes from the third chapter in my book. And this chapter is titled, I Hate You. And it is a chapter where I am reflecting on and taking the reader through my elementary school experiences. And so the excerpt that I'm going to read for you all today is actually the end of the chapter where I'm doing a summation or a summary of my thoughts regarding my elementary school experience. So again, this is an excerpt from chapter 3, I Hate You. Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your heads to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? These words, directed to an audience of hundreds of Black people, loudly came from Malcolm X's mouth during a speech at the funeral of Ronald Stokes in May of 1962 in Los Angeles, California. Before saying these words, he condemned the United States for their lack of school integration through the Supreme Court ruling, though the Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education happened 8 years prior. He went on to say, who taught you to hate the race you belong to, so much so that you don't want to be around each other? I have listened to that speech many times within the last year and have reflected on Malcolm's question, who taught you to hate yourself? As I think about my elementary school experience, I believe it was a breeding ground for the hatred that Malcolm spoke of. Though I had experienced the consequences of systemic racism in our American society before entering elementary school, my time there cultivated, developed, and normalized the hatred. From the mistreatment of Black students in my classrooms, to the hatred Black boys had for me and I for them, to the lack of positive liberatory teaching of Black history and Black contributions to the United States, to the academic tracking that once again segregated students by race beginning in 4th grade, to discriminatory comments made by teachers. All of these elements taught hate. They taught the Black student to hate who they were and to see themselves as less in a society built on their oppression. They taught Black students that they were second-class citizens and schools meant to educate them. They taught them that being around one another was not a positive circumstance, but rather a negative one. They taught that suppression was the only way to survive. So if I had the privilege to be in the audience on that day in Los Angeles in 1962 and respond to Malcolm's question, who taught you to hate yourself? I would answer that our American schools are one of the biggest teachers of self-hatred to Black and brown people in this country. And in my experience, it begins early in elementary school. I would go on to argue that in any good lesson, you should be able to see the outcomes of what was taught. And by looking at the state of Black students based on statistics, by the time they enter middle school, the lesson in self-hatred is one of the best our educational system teaches. And so that was first excerpt that I wanted to share with you all from, again, the 3rd chapter of my book, I Hate You. And then this next excerpt that I'll share with you all is from the 8th chapter of my book, entitled The New Talented 10th. And this chapter highlights some of my teaching experience, some of my experiences as a teacher at a prominent charter network in New York City. And so again, the excerpt that I'm going to read comes at the end of that chapter, where it's a reflection piece on my experience teaching at the school. As I reflect on my time, and I want to say this also just before I jump into reading this. So all names mentioned in this chapter are pseudonyms, and also the name of the actual charter network is I'm just going to call it the charter school. So as I reflect on my time at the charter school, the burning question in my mind is, when was the moment? At what point did I know that as a Black man, I was actively participating in and upholding a school environment that was harmful to students who looked like me? Was it when I failed to be there to support Devin and his mother from feeling bullied out of the network? Or was it when I crushed Xavier's spirit in front of the class because of a grade? Or was it when I made mental excuses for the behaviors of my colleagues that I knew were harmful to students, or failed to speak up when I felt silenced? Was it when my grandmother called me to share her concern that I was teaching at a network where the teachers acted inappropriately with students over minor infractions? Perhaps the moment of realization happened when the only white male student in the school, who was subconsciously privileged so much in the environment, called me a nigger the moment I held him accountable. Maybe a better question is, did the moment ever come? Was my need to be successful at my job too great to make me have the moment of realization I needed? Was the academic achievement of my Black and Latinx students by the state standards too vital for me to come to terms with the harm I perpetuated? What are the human costs of being part of the new talented 10th in our educational system? I know what it meant for me as a child, desperately trying to assimilate to a culture where my authentic self was undesirable and placing my worth only in my achievements. Were the costs the same for my students at the charter school? And what did my example as their teacher show them? Du Bois once said in his book, The Talented Tenth, that the Negro race, like all other races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. I am not quite convinced that at the charter school, I am not quite convinced that the charter school environment or other charter schools in general develop such exceptional people, nor am I convinced that during my time there, I was one of them. And so thank you all for just listening to me share a couple of excerpts from my forthcoming book. And from there, I think, Dr. Sullivan, if I'm correct, we're just going to go into some, maybe a panel discussion of some questions.
You're muted.
Thank you. I want to give us a little space to be on the screen with our speaker as well. So let me do this part. I don't know if that works. In light of what you read, I found it really interesting where you were talking about, so you're reading about what Malcolm X had asked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the middle of that section, you talk about, you mentioned from the mistreatment of Black students in my classrooms to the hatred Black boys had for me and I for them,
Mm-hmm.
to the lack of positive teaching of Black history and Black contributions to the United States, to the academic tracking that once again segregated students by race beginning in 4th grade, to discriminatory comments made by teachers. So you talk about all of them teaching hate. Can we break them apart a little bit and discuss them? How about, as somebody who's not in the Department of Education, I'm surprised to find tracking is still going on. Can you address tracking for a moment, and then maybe some of the other aspects like not teaching Black history well in grade school?
Sure. Yeah. So, and this isn't, so again, this was at the time when I was in elementary school. Tracking was definitely in South Carolina public schools, and especially the public school in Sumter. Tracking was a definite thing. And unfortunately, in South Carolina and in Sumter in particularly, it is still something that goes on. And surprisingly, it does happen across the United States still. And someone mentioned tracking still exists today in New Jersey. And so it is something that happens. And I think what tracking did at the elementary school level for me, and in my experience, and what I have seen it do also just as an adult working on a district level and in a school, is it begins to separate students based on who's high achieving or who's smart and versus who isn't. And oftentimes, as we all are aware of, that separation is racially a racial divide as well, right? A racial and socioeconomic divide, right? And so oftentimes your white, wealthier students are the ones who are tracked in these classes. And just to explain what tracking is so essentially it's when you begin to separate students based on how they're performing or their potential to perform, right? So you would place high achieving students in a particular track of classes separate from students who aren't performing as well. And that tracking is often racialized in schools across the United States. And
it influences what they get taught?
Yes, and it influences what they get taught, who teaches them. Normally, the more veteran, experienced teachers teach the highest performing students, or those students who are in those high performing track classes, and the inexperienced, maybe a new teacher, they're placed in those classes that are the general education or the classes that are not those of the students that are higher achieving. And then the curriculum is very much different. And then the pedagogy and how you're teaching the curriculum is also very different, right? And so in my experience, and I talk a lot about this in my book, as I started to be tracked in classes, I was one of the few students of color, definitely one of the few and sometimes the only Black male in my classes. And just how the teacher approached teaching was in many ways very different than what some of my counterparts, friends, or even I had experienced prior to being tracked, right? There was a lot of autonomy that was given to the students, a lot more, I would just say, like joy that was in the classroom from the teacher, and allowed for the students to express that joy as well. And so a lot of very clear distinctions in that tracking. And so why I say that the tracking was an element of teaching of hate, right, of hatred, is because of the racial disparities that happen within the tracking. And that tied into the element where I said that schools taught that Black kids being around one another was something that was negative, right? And so because the non-track classes, that's where all the Black students were. And that was, oh, you don't want to be in that class. Oh, you're in the dumb class, or you're in the whatever class. And then the teacher is more aggravated, more behavioral issues, like so many other things that are going on. And so this idea that me being around someone who looks like me and someone who has a similar experience as me is a negative, or presents itself in an environment that is negative, is a way to really teach you, oh, well, then what does this mean about me? Or what does this mean about my identity or who I am and what I'm bringing into the school? And even how teachers respond. And I talk about this a lot in my book as well. Like teachers just seemed happier in the classes that were high achieving, like the teachers, how they approach students, how they just seemed like they showed a lot more joy. And so it was almost like, I'm happy to be in this class, but I'm annoyed to have to teach this class. And that, if you imagine what that does to a child's mind as they're developing, especially their own self-identity, being around this adult teacher, being around a class of students who look all like me, they're upset and angry, because I guess something is inherently wrong with us. But when they're not in that setting, they're happy and excited. And so that then reinforces that self-perception.
The same thing carry over into the charter school setting. They're also tracking there?
So the interesting thing about charter schools, and especially some of the larger charter networks and some of these big, larger cities, such as New York City, there is not the element of tracking as it is in the traditional public school. But these charter schools are specifically targeted for Black and Brown students living in poverty. And so the charter network that I worked for was specifically like their student population was, like my school in particular, I would say 98% Black and Latinx students who come from, a low socioeconomic, who have free and reduced lunch. That's what they call it in school terms. And so that presented a whole host of other issues as well. So it's not necessarily the tracking, but it's like, well, how are rules and regulations and behavioral behavioral rules implemented, right, for these set of students to then lead them on a successful academic track. And so it was not necessarily the class tracking that would happen and you had some of that, like you did have, they would pull students who were the high achieving students out to do like some mini lessons here or there, but it wasn't necessarily they were placed in separate classes because everyone was essentially supposed to be high achieving. But the approach to teaching was very different in that charter school setting versus the traditional public school.
So, wow, in that space, so you also talk about this, just talk random about the teaching of Black history or Black contributions, like what are Black children in either or the public school at the grade school level hearing or learning about themselves? Right.
And so, I think that is a big piece of how I believe hatred is perpetuated and taught in schools is through the lack of teaching, positive liberatory teaching of the Black experience in the United States. And so from my experience in education as a student and also as a teacher and working at the district level, there is a gross, there's extreme lack of just liberatory teaching of Black history, Black experiences. Normally, when we talk about Black history and from an elementary school level or in general, it normally starts at, a mention of slavery, then elements of the civil rights. But it is always talking about the Black oppression, right? And then, at least in my elementary school experience, one of the few Black civil rights leaders that was talked about was Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's talked about as like, he had a dream. He wanted all of us to come together and not be judged by the color of our skin. And then he was murdered, and then we move on from that. And you have to understand in a child's development and in a Black child's development where and there are plenty of studies out there and research out there that shows that a child's sense of identity and sense of self is developed at these young ages, and seeing role models and seeing people who look like them, who have, positive in a positive light is very important. And for a school and for school in general, really not to highlight that for Black, Brown, Indigenous students is very damaging. And then the only time it is highlighted is to talk about your oppression in this system and in this society is also very damaging. So
they're not teaching freedom fighters that live.
Exactly. They're not teaching freedom fighters that live. They're not teaching, and Black history does not start at slavery. It does not start at the civil rights movement. And there is a lot of Black liberatory stories and Black liberation stories that can be taught and should be taught that would empower students, right, to see their own ability to be critical thinkers of their society, to be civically engaged, and to really show some of the contributions that are important within their own culture and their own race.
Some of the Black history we should be teaching should be before the United States.
Yes, definitely. Because I think when you think about it, from a standpoint of two students, a Black and a white student, right? And then you can talk about all the other students as well, like an Asian American student, an Indigenous student, a Latinx student. As you're moving through the educational system, if I'm a white male student, I see the constant affirmation of my success, right? And my brilliance, my leadership, my tenacity, my ability to overcome and conquer and lead. I see that constantly. when I am looking at or learning about my history. All of my teachers growing up in my particular school system were white teachers, right? So I also see it in the adults who are now talking to me about this. If I'm in one of those other categories, the non-white male category, I'm not necessarily hearing that at all, right? I'm saying how I'm lower in society. I don't have a voice. A lot of things I have to overcome. I haven't really contributed a lot to this society and the way it is. And mind you, and I talk about this in my book a lot too. In the first chapter of my book, it actually highlights before I even enter school and some of the racialized experiences that I had prior to even entering into school, that school is just further perpetuated. And so I'm already experiencing a world, and I might not be able to articulate it, that is showing me that I'm different, right? And that experiences and my experiences are a little different than the dominant aspect of society and the dominant people within the society. And so that's already going on in my mind. And then when I'm entering into school, that is just further perpetuated in what I'm taught, who I'm taught by, how I'm taught. And then that just continues on throughout my school trajectory.
So I want to open this up and let other people ask questions as well. Is anybody willing to unmute and use your voice and add any questions that are out there?
I have a question.
Okay, thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can. Yes, hi.
So thank you, Brian, for sharing with us. You said that in the charter schools, the approach to teaching was very different.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about that? In what ways did you find it different?
Yeah. So I want to say, so the approach to teaching was different, but also the environment and the approach to schooling as a whole was different, right? And so one of the biggest differences that I saw in working in a charter school and in charter schools in general that I engage with and work with that predominantly serve Black and Brown students, specifically low-income students, is around the emphasis on behavioral management. That is a very big difference from the traditional school experience, and you're starting to see it actually a little bit more in the traditional school experience as well, right? Because a lot of schools are starting to pick up some of those behavioral management aspects. But for instance, so students, and I was a third grade teacher, and students had to sit in their desk with their hands locked, their back straight, the entire time. They had to track the speaker. So if I were to walk to one side of the classroom, they had to turn their head to walk. And if they didn't do this, it's not just like, oh, Carol, look this direction. It's like, oh, that's a mark against you. Like that is a consequence, right? And if you get enough consequences, then that takes away from your recess time, your free time, that, could lead you to being suspended. That could, it's so many aspects. And so that was a very big piece of the difference and approach to teaching. It was like we had to control every aspect of the child to reach those academic successes that we wanted to reach, right? And that was what was taught to us as teachers in the network. It was like this: you have to have structure and order and civility in the classroom if the students are going to be successful. Like, these students can't be left to their own devices. They can't have fun. They can't have a lot of joy, because if they do that, then it's just gonna really go downhill, right? And so that was a really big difference. Also, one of the things is, so my charter school that I worked for in particular really had a high emphasis, especially starting in third grade, which was the first testing year, right? The first year that students begin to take the state test, on really just only a focus on math and reading comprehension, and a disregard of everything else. So in the earlier discussion with Dr. Sullivan, how I was talking about the teaching of the liberatory teaching of Black history, there was just no history being taught in general, right? Because it didn't matter, because what mattered is what they were going to make on the state test. And as we know, through the No Child Left Behind Act era that really started to drive a lot of this testing and achieving for schools to receive funding, a lot of charter networks then became prominent underneath that because they were able to produce these high test results to then get the funding. And that was all that mattered, but that wasn't it wasn't a comprehensive or holistic approach to teaching. So those two aspects were the big differences around just the management of behaviors and also just the sole focus on mathematics and reading comprehension for the sake of the test.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You're describing the experience that I had working for 3 years, not as a faculty member, but as a university researcher and collaborator, not at a charter school, but a magnet school in Philadelphia.
Yep.
And I had, it broke my heart. And now I hear you saying, yeah, that's the way it is. And, and not only the extreme emphasis on reading comprehension, because I was in literacy, but computerized programs that constituted, it was skill and drill.
Yes.
And when I tried to talk to the teachers about that, I thought it was so sad that these were wonderful people, well-intentioned, but they honestly believed when they said to me, the students really love these programs because they get charts and they see that they're making improvements. So they know that they're becoming better readers. But as you said, what they were doing was learning skills to help pass a test.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and you put any children are sponges. They're amendable. You put them in any environment. They're going to show joy. If this is the thing that this is what you're going to be excited about. I mean, we would do it with my students, like, guess how many kids are in the green on these, on our internal assessments, our mock state test exams. The whole class is on, the whole class passed or made proficient, and then everyone's like, yay, that's so exciting. Yay, Mr. Fuller, of course. But like, is that what joy of learning is, being proficient? And then that's it. And then what I also noticed too with students is, and similarly to how I was as a child as well, is they begin to put their worth in their achievement, right? And so it was like, if I don't make the grade or if I don't achieve, and oftentimes the adults in the building, we perpetuated that, right? And so if I don't make the grade, if I don't achieve, then I'm not worthy, or I'm not good, or I should be punished. And a lot of times they were being punished or having consequences for not performing well, right? And so that was just, again, that programming that the only thing that matters is what you make on this exam, and nothing else about, joy, learning about yourself, all of those things that are necessary for you to develop into a fully realized person, was just out the window.
We have here a question from a high school teacher and a doctoral candidate in education. And she asks, so it's in the chat.
Got it.
So she's saying.
She has her hand raised.
Oh,
okay, great.
You want to just unmute and
Jocelyn.
ask the question straight up?
Yes. Yes. Hi, Jocelyn.
Hi, thank you. I had just clicked lower hand once that, I have so many emotions around this. And so I was trying to, I didn't get to the unmute button earlier, but I mean, I have a couple of I don't even know where to start. I mean, all right, a few concise questions. One,
Yes.
what are you doing now?
Mm.
Two, it's so important for, I believe, of course, for Black and Brown students to see themselves in the curriculum, in the administration, in the teaching staff. But I almost think it's equally as important for the white students to see that as
yes.
well.
Mm.
And I say this as a white student, right?
Mm-hmm,
My one experience in public school was in high school. And it was, it was fascinating to say the least. How do you, but I think, so I'm an ally, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes students connect with me because they think they're seeing, you look like my cousin, or you look like, or, and it's like, all right, let me talk to you about this. This is my background. This is where my ancestors are from, but this is why we're going to connect, and I talk about how, we're woke in the classroom, and how, like you were saying earlier, it's not, yes, slavery is important to learn about, but we need to examine the experience of Black and Brown people outside of slavery,
yes,
in an empowering way.
Yes.
And so I'm a Spanish teacher, but a lot of my students are considered communication impaired because they lacked prerequisite skills, because they were tracked at such an early age.
Yeah.
And I'm like, are you kidding? Like, the
Correct.
state of New Jersey requires 1 year of a world language, but Checkmark High School requires 2, even though the state allows for an exemption for special education students, so they could learn what a noun and a verb are in English. But here we are. So we learn about, I created a unit who was here first, right, in the Spanish speaking Americas. And so it's a way of exploring colonialism.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of schools aren't doing that. So that's great.
Well, I don't even think they know what we're doing. They're like, oh, great. This goes with the state mandates. But I feel like it's a drop in the bucket.
Right.
Because I'm one teacher. And there's a whole institution.
Yes.
So how do you propose, this is a huge question. How do you propose, we go forward in order to work towards equity?
Yeah, no. Well, thank you for sharing, first of all, just your experiences as an educator and as a student. So to answer your first question, what am I doing now? So right now I am, and I think Dr. Sullivan might have mentioned this, but so I am freelance consulting with an organization called the LearnLaunch Institute. And so essentially, and they're a Boston-based organization. And so they provide workshops or professional learning for districts and schools across the New England area. And so I'm brought in to develop workshops. So I developed a Lead for Equity series. And so I teach, do equity teaching and professional development for district and school leaders and teachers. Also, I do other things outside of equity too in my workshop developments, like workshops on continuous improvement and things of that nature. But essentially it's supporting districts and schools for improvement, all really undergirded and focused around equity. And then of course I'm finishing up the book and doing speaking engagements and all of those things as well. And then but to your second question around what do we do collectively, or what do we do as a system, really? And I would say, honestly, that is why I took time to really write this book, because so at the time that I decided to step away from New York City Department of Education, which is the largest, district in the country. It's really 1.3 million students. They say 1.1, but if you include the charter schools, it's 1.3 million students. It was right at the heart of, Ahmaud Arbery had been killed, George Floyd had been killed, and as a country, we were starting to have these conversations around our criminal justice system and the acknowledgement of its inherent racist nature, right? And I feel like that is a very necessary discussion, a very valid discussion. In my book, I talk a lot about my experience with my father being incarcerated, and how that played into my psyche as I moved throughout school. But with that discussion and that national attention to that discussion that was happening, I felt like there's also a lot of inherent racism in our American educational system that we don't really touch on that often, right? Like everyone's saying, oh, we need to focus on equity. But it's always in the sense of closing these like gaps or, achievement gaps, but it's never a really look at like the foundational aspect of our American educational system and why we are constantly getting the outcomes and having the experiences that we're having in it. And so that really led me to write this book. And I think one of the ways that we begin to address this more holistically is to really acknowledge the fact that our American educational system in many ways is inherently racist, and it's inherently perpetuating a white supremacist narrative, right? And so it's number one, the acknowledgement of it, but then so once we acknowledge it, then it's like, okay, what do we do to change it? And as you mentioned, like you're doing great work, but you're a drop in the bucket. And you said like the school might not even know what you're doing, right? They don't care, they're whatever. And I think that's true, like, because and so I think a big piece of this is acknowledging it and then creating the systems, structures, and practices to then start to dismantle and change it and transform it, right? And then giving the support to do that, the teaching and the support needed to do that, right? Because a lot of the teachers might say like, yeah, I know I should be doing liberatory teaching of Black and Brown Indigenous students' experiences, but like, where do I find that? Or how do I do that? Or where does that look like? And so also providing the resources and the supports so that teachers can effectively do it. And so I think that's how we begin to transform it. It's one, acknowledging it, which we haven't done. And I think that is a big national acknowledgement of like, hey, our educational system at its foundation has a lot of issues. And in many ways, it's perpetuating this racial hierarchy, which is within our society. And then that acknowledgement, even with that acknowledgement, you have to then begin to interrogate and really look at with a critical lens the systems and structures that are in place that create what is the American educational experience, public educational experience. I hope that helps, or I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a tall task.
Yes, it's a tall task for sure.
Would you say we need a different vision? Like, is the system structured around the wrong core worldview?
Yes, I think so. I mean, and I talk about this in the last chapter of my book, which I'm still like mulling over and writing. So this conversation will probably add to that. But yeah, I think so. Historically, how education, if we look at historically how even our educational system became a compulsory education of what it is today, meaning you legally have to go to school at, from this age to this age, or your parents will get in trouble or your caretakers will get in trouble. That even the onset of compulsory education in this country, the focus of that, and it's really interesting, and I talk about this in my book and through research, that happened in the 1920s, right? Like the start of the compulsory educational system, public educational system in America really started in the 1920s. And that was around a really big influx of immigration in the United States. And what was happening is literacy was down. And so, but it didn't matter in the sense of literacy for the sake of learning to be critical thinkers of the society or anything like that. It was more of like, someone's getting their fingers chopped off in a factory because they don't know how to read the sign type thing, right? And so education became mandated for the sense of so that you could just churn out these like factory workers essentially, and you can churn out people to be productive in society in the ways that society wanted them to be, not in the way of being like critical or being civically engaged or self-reflective or learning aspects about their culture and who they were, but it was more of just like to keep the wheels turning. And then also another big piece of this, which I don't think a lot of people know, but so compulsory education in the 1920s, a lot of the advocacy for that actually was led by the Ku Klux Klan at the time, which is actually surprising when you think about it, and is not really talked about. And a lot of it was started in Ohio, actually. And at the time, the rhetoric that the Klan was making was around the Americanization of citizens. And because, as I mentioned, it was a lot of influx of immigrants coming in. And of course, we all know at the time it was big anti-Black movement. Like, we lived in an anti-Black society. And so they even, and this got struck down in a lot of places, but in the early conversations of it, Klan members were going and looking through the text and the things that were being presented in a compulsory education standpoint, from a compulsory education standpoint, to say like, does this represent America, or is this what America represents? And so that should tell you a lot in itself of what was chosen to highlight how we chose to talk about certain instances and aspects of our history, what we chose to teach. And then, of course, there was still, schools were then still very segregated. And then with the Brown v. Board of Education and ruling in 1954, like that, the integration changed, but there's still, as I mentioned, my school in New York City that I taught in was still 98% Black and brown. And so, there is definitely, to answer your question, I feel like I went around, but I just wanted to give that context. Definitely, I think there is a new vision for education that needs to be much more empowering, much more liberatory, much more autonomous, much more student-centered, child-centered. Yes, exactly. Much more student, child-centered, that would not only impact and benefit Black, brown, and Indigenous children, but would benefit all children, right? If you took that perspective.
I see two hands, Latonia and then Dr. Blank. Would you like to unmute?
Thank you, Latanya, and that's okay. I just wondered, Mr. Fuller, from your perspective, what should a parent do for advocating for a more equitable classes and education for their child? And I specifically was struck by your explanation of the tracking system. And so if a parent is presented with an opportunity for their child to be tracked in that, whether you're calling it upward mobility, some districts call it talented and gifted program. Is it a situation, based on what your observations are, where the parent should say, no, I would rather my child not be separated from their classroom, and is that dependent upon what their regular classroom is made, what the makeup is racially. If they're one of, few Black and brown children in the classroom to begin with, does it make a difference to you? And, from a parental standpoint, what would you suggest parents do to advocate for the more equitable educational system?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And so partially around specifically to your point around like gifted and talented within districts, various districts, and parents being presented the opportunity for their child to be placed in those classes. So I personally wouldn't say for a parent, especially a parent of color, if presented with that opportunity to say, no, I don't want my child in that environment. And the reason being is because for some of the reasons that I mentioned before, in terms of the experiential or the experience of some of those classes and those opportunities. I think oftentimes in those higher achieving classes, the gifted and talented classes, they experience more of the student-centered approach, more of the rigor, academic rigor, the ability to be critical thinkers of a changing society. And so I think that is beneficial for all students and definitely beneficial for students of color. So in that aspect, if presented with the opportunity for your child, if this is your district makeup and presented for the opportunity for your child to enter into that program, I wouldn't necessarily decline it. However, from a parental perspective, what I would do is, and this is where, PTAs and like parent agitators and all of these things come into play here, is really advocate for the removal of the tracking system as a whole, right? And you see districts are already starting to do this. New York City is one of them. There are parent groups and also people who sit within New York City Department of Education who believe that we should do away with gifted and talented programs, who believe, and New York City has exam high schools, these high schools that you test into that are like the top high schools in the city. And those, as you could imagine, those high schools are predominantly, Asian American and one type of Asian American and white students, and everyone else is not a part of it. And so there has been a push to really remove a lot of those separations and have a more inclusive educational experience. And so I think as a parent, first of all, galvanizing and building a coalition of other parents, like-minded parents, right, who feel like my culture, my culture, my being, my race, my child's experiences, that is important to be seen and heard in a school. And then so going to your school and in your district and advocating for that and just asking them those questions. What are you doing to affirm the culture of my child? What are you doing to affirm the race of my child? Show me in the curriculum. I just press them to show you. And then also say, what are you doing to allow for a more inclusive educational experiences where every child can experience the best curricular and pedagogical opportunities, right? And are exposed to the best resources, and begin to ask those questions and agitate in ways where the district then starts to have answers for you. And then also too, another thing that I think is really important is, what are you doing to train and support your teacher? Well, first of all, what are you doing to train around racial equity consciousness, right? And equity consciousness in your school or in your district? I think that's a really important question, right? Like, are they having conversations around internalized bias that we all have? Are they having those racial equity conversations? And then also, what are you doing to support teachers? And that goes back to the other question of, how are you affirming my kid? What are you doing to support teachers and giving them the tools to help them affirm my kid, right? And how can I be a resource to you as well? And so I think that is some of the ways that I have seen parents do it, and some of the ways that I would advocate for parents to do it. But I would say if your structure and if your system is already set up where you have those, when a lot of districts are, where you have those gifted and talented programs, you have that tracking already in place. And if your child is presented that opportunity, I wouldn't necessarily decline it, because you always too, and of course, all parents want this, you want your child to have whatever that best academic experience is, but you also want it to be one that affirms and supports who they are and their identity. And you want the school to know that that matters to you. Sorry, Dr. Sullivan, I think you're muted.
Bad timing for me to be muted. Dr. Blank, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. This has been very, very interesting. I had two different questions, but I think I'm just going to focus on one. I'm curious. I feel like there's this, and it's because I'm a historian. I'm not in education. I'm curious.
But that's great. A historian.
No. Yeah. And my other question was a little bit about history, but I was going to point out that AP has a lot of Black history in it. And so white kids are actually getting more Black history in those sort of tracked, like in those high level, there's more Black history being offered than those tracks that are dependent on textbooks where Black history has been erased. But what I was just wanting to know, because you're an expert in this field, is like, can you tell me a little bit about identity formation? How is we talk a lot about it being important to see, to hear about Black liberatory history, and can you tell me a little bit about like how child development and how seeing teachers, just a little bit of how that identity formation happens, so that, and what the literature says about it, like really concretely. So like when somebody comes up and says, why is that's not that important? Because I feel like with this critical race theory sort of brouhaha that's going on around, it's like, it's not seen as being something as an important thing to consider is the student's identity. Everybody needs the same thing is kind of, I think, where you get this sort of color blindness kind of. Can you talk a little bit about what the scholarship says about how important identity formation and racial identity formation happens in schools?
Yeah, I mean, well, identity formation and racial formation, racial identity formation happens even before you enter into school, especially for those non-white students. And so even thinking about gender formation as early as 2, many student or children are already identifying with a gender identity, right? And then they are relating that to what they see in their parents and the in the world around them, and then they're mimicking those behaviors of whatever particular gender that they are identifying with, right? And similarly, for racial identity, that starts early for non-white. What has been shown, studies have shown that it starts a lot earlier for non-white children because of this element of trauma and systemic racism that is experienced within a society. And so, because, and I talk about this in my book in the first chapter. So one of my earliest memories that I experienced or have is at the age of 3, I visited my father in jail. And he was sitting behind a glass partition. And as my little 3-year-old eyes were moving around, I saw that all of the other men in the other glass partitions next to him were also Black males. And I don't even know, when I think about it, I don't even know what was the spark, of course, that started or made me identify my race as Black at that time, but I knew at 3 that I was Black. And I knew that all those men there, including my father, were Black men. And so, because in the same way that gender identity starts to form, and then you start to model that behavior, and you start to see, and then based on that modeling and based on what you see within the adults and the caretakers and the society around you, you start to form your own identity and your own sense of self and your own sense of self-worth, right? Within your environment, within your context. It happens similarly with the racial identity as well. And as that is forming. And so for me, you can imagine within that, that initial experience, what that would have started to articulate to myself around that. And so why racial identity affirmation is so important, and especially at a young age, is because for students coming in to schools, especially non-white students, they already have a sense of self and a racialized identity that is not a part of the dominant racial identity group within this country. And they more than likely 90%, and I know there is research out there with it, and I can't think of the exact study with it. Oh, if you think about the study that when they show dolls to, and we've all seen that study, right? And so they already have that negative association with their racialized sense of self. And so that's why it's so important to begin to counter that when they're entering into school. And critical race theory, it is, and as you mentioned, but it's
about teaching race and racism in schools, and they don't want to, and I feel like there's this way that they don't want that content to be in there, whereas what you're saying is how important it is to be in there, and
how important, and especially at the early age, it's important for the affirming racialized identity teaching, that is so important. And so,
and it's important for white students too, right?
Exactly. Yes.
That they need to have those because they're watching the same television and all that kind of stuff. And so they need to also start to reformulate how they see race and their own race in relationship.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Dr. Blanca. I hope that answered your question.
Other questions? I'm willing to look in the chat as well. Anybody want to unmute or put something in the chat?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
The comment I have is when I was reading the book, the excerpts, and talking about the challenge, the classes, the challenge classes, or the, what do you call them? Gifted program. And in those programs, you were saying that the students went on field trips.
Yes.
And that's something I just wanted to highlight. When you're going on these field trips, you're gaining social capital, you're gaining etiquette skills, all these things that we know are extremely important in the business and the corporate world. So this is just furthering the gap between the children who don't test into these classes and the children who do. So therefore, they're just getting left behind further and further because now they don't have these social skills. They've never been to the museum in the city. They've never been to galleries or festivals or whatever, wherever you were going on these field trips that enlighten you and made you better equipped to take SAT scores. SAT tests, all of these things. So it's like, I see what you're saying. And then what if you have a sibling who's the same age and they don't qualify academically to get into the gifted program? So here it is, you have one child that's getting exceptional education and culture and knowledge and all of these things, and the other child isn't. So I'm somewhat in agreement of doing away with them for that, because we all know how much more that social skills are just as important as the education as far as going out to dinner with the client when trying to make a business deal, all of this. And if you don't get that at a young age, it's really hard to just develop it at 30 years old.
Yes, no, that's so true. So true. And even to just go off of that a little bit. So the organization, and I talk about this in the book too, the organization that the Philadelphia region of the nonprofit that I launched in Philadelphia, the DREAM program, we provided mentorship for children living in low-income housing across the city of Philadelphia, and we partnered them with undergraduate college student mentors. And in many instances, the low-income housing was a few blocks from the university where they were, the university where the mentors came from. But the students living in the housing had never been to the university, had never been to certain aspects of the city, and so many different things. And it was so eye-opening for not only the undergraduate students, but also for me and for those students that just like the experiential piece that you talk about, right? Like just being able to just go on a college campus or go to a part of the city that you've never been to experience something else, just gets your brain moving in a way that you had never even thought about or dreamed of before. And so I think that's so important. And I think every child deserves to experience that. And that doesn't often happen.
And I see a hand. Daquan, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I'm just, I think oftentimes when we talk about DI work, we talk about solutions, we talk about some of the issues, we talk about some of the systemic nature of the issues that we are currently facing. But I also think it's important for specifically Black folks to dream and to imagine. Yes. So I'm curious to hear you speak about what that looks like in the ideal for you. What does after all of this, at the end of the day, what is the goal? And like, if we are able to employ our radical imaginations, what is the outcome for you?
No, that's a big question, Daquan. And I love that question. Well, first of all, I love that you highlighted the need for Black and Brown people just to have the opportunity to dream and to imagine and to use their imagination. And I think so. One big part of the reason that I'm writing this book is to, and I talk about this in a lot of when I'm talking about the differing of experiences or the disparity in experiences and opportunities given throughout my time that I've seen within the educational system is oftentimes we look at when we're engaging with white students, engaging with white students in these classes, in these settings, they're often encouraged to dream, encouraged to imagine, especially when you look at the higher achieving scenarios and classes and circumstances, right? I even think about it in the International Baccalaureate program. We had a class called Theory of Knowledge, TOK, where you were able to debate topics and think critically about the world, about whatever you wanted to talk about sometimes. And just the encouragement of that, you don't often see, to your point, or that's not, Black and Brown students aren't even often allowed to do that, right? And so the goal for me with this is, like I said earlier, is one, to first just acknowledge the inherent flaws within the current system, right? Like I think, and the inherent racism that is within the current system, and so to acknowledge that, but then also to really highlight, because another thing that I think we don't talk about a lot is how historically there have been movements to try to rectify, I guess, what you're talking about. Like, so the freedom schools, for instance, of the 1960s, that was a big movement, liberatory education for Black people within this country, that they were student-centered. Children were allowed to critically think and engage, and encouraged to critically think and engage within their society. They were encouraged to challenge the status quo and the social norms. But as you can imagine, then those schools became, iced out and not supported financially, not supported from other resources. And so they were phased out. Also, Detroit had African-American liberatory educational schools for a time frame, and they actually expanded. But in the same way, through state and local regulations, those schools were phased out because they weren't meeting the standards that needed to be met. And so my hope and my goal for this is really to highlight the importance of this liberatory education for all people, right? But specifically Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And then to your point of, or your question of, what does that mean will happen? I think that's to be determined, right? Like if you're really educating youth in a way that they are able to critically engage with their society, they are able to really imagine and dream, as you mentioned. I think the sky's the limit. But I think that is a part, I think this movement, the educational movement piece, is a part of a broader societal American piece that's happening right now before us, right? In terms of really thinking through a lot of our American systems, and really challenging them and pushing to transform them. And I think this educational piece is also a huge part of that. And so that's the goal. I want this to be a part of the larger conversation. And I want primarily an acknowledgement that our American education system as it is right now is inherently racist as well.
So as we're running low on time, there's one more question in the chat, and I also want to throw the floor open to you for one other thought.
Yeah.
So the question in the chat is, if you could go back in time, and back to when you were, it got away from me. Back to when
I see it.
Yeah. Mixed microaggressions with colleagues at the charter school, what would you say? So that's if you could unmute yourself in the past. And also, would you like to address, if you were writing curriculum in the future, the kinds of things that you would, what you would construct a school day or a curriculum to look like in that imagined space? So I'll just shut up.
Okay. So the first question of, if I could go back to the time when I saw the colleagues saying the microaggressions or, displaying microaggressions, what would I say? So I think first, I think about some instances come to mind in particular. I would stop them. Number one, like I'm another adult in the situation. And so I would stop them, and say like, hey, that's not what we do. Then I would use it as a way to and in some instances, I will say that this did happen, right? When some things were egregious or whatever, but, and then use it as a way to be a teaching moment, right? Like, and we say this with students all the time, like teachable moments, or with kids, like, oh, use this as a teachable moment, but really use it to then open up a discussion with them of why that is and coming from an adult perspective, right? Because oftentimes, and this is sad, but oftentimes adults, we don't necessarily listen to little kids and their voices and what their perspective on things. And so from adult perspective, really use the shared language and terminology that they can understand and comprehend why this is problematic and why this is harmful to that student, that they are the student that is experiencing the end of their microaggression, or who's on the receiving end of their microaggression. So I would stop it, then I would acknowledge and use it as a teachable moment to explain what that is, what they did, and then how that is harmful to that student and why it's so important not to do that to that student. And then I would probably also put it in their try to put it in their perspective from their lens so they can see it, right? Like, so try to put them in my talking with them, try to put them in the receiving end of something similar to see how they would then process that. So that's how I would do that. And then to your broader question, Dr. Sullivan. So I talk about this a lot in the last chapter, so I don't want to give away too much of it, but I really think you have to have key elements key elements. I call them key elements that you focus on, or focus areas, right? One being racial and identity affirmation in a curriculum, right? Like, that is very important. Also, another aspect is teaching or the promotion of what it means to be a critical thinker and civically engaged within your society. And so if you look at it as, and I break it down in the last chapter, but it's like these various umbrella elements of a curriculum, right? So like, if a curriculum is culturally responsive, racially and identity affirming, if it is empowering, so teaching civic engagement and advocacy, if it is rigorous and pushing the kids to develop their own self-efficacy. And so when I say that, that means kids are learning to fail, but knowing that's a part of the learning process and being encouraged to fail and then rethink and try it again. All those various aspects being a part of it, right? And then also it being very student-centered. So taking what the child is already experiencing, what they're interested in, and then shaping their curriculum as they progress and as they get older around that, making sure that all these elements are still covered, right? So within that, so let's say if I'm a student that is very interested in, I don't know, dolphins or whatever, sea animals, then that is, how do I build out a curriculum that then allows them to pursue that interest or that passion? And as they get older, maybe even put them into some apprenticeship type situations where they're able to then explore what that will look like as a career, as a, something that they continue to engage with, while throughout the entire time continuously affirming and supporting their identities, encouraging them and challenging them to be critical thinkers of their world, to be, what does it mean to be civically engaged, and also all the other various aspects. But I don't want to give too much away because, of course, it's going to be in the book. But I think that is very important.
Reading and math as they study dolphins.
Yeah. Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, all the core elements around the reading comprehension. I feel like those are the basic skills that are needed to exist in society. So, of course, the math, the reading, but the broader pieces around their identity and who they are holistically as a person is really important as well.
So they're getting to put in much more self-direction.
Yes.
To their program of study. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to unmute for a final word?
Just as a middle school teacher going through probably the hardest teaching years, last couple of years, this has been so inspiring, especially on the face of burnout, and I'm hoping I can share my notes with my colleagues who are, in doing this work too. And so just thank you for taking the time out to talk to us. And, it was awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sam. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. You're right. These past 2 years in education, especially for teachers, has been so difficult. And I just want to say, and I know other people might have other comments as well, but I feel like the pandemic and what in the aftermath of the pandemic, especially in schools and especially how our kids are showing up, is proof that we need to really be rethinking how we do education. And so I think this is a very pivotal moment in our society in general, but specifically in education, because it's really no going back to what we were doing before. And I think our students are very much showing that, right? And so it's how are we as a system now going to respond to that? And what are we going to do to transform it?
Anyone else?
Ryan, this is Jocelyn. I just want to thank you. And ask, I don't know if this is something that would go through you, Dr. Sullivan, but if we were able to agitate sufficiently to have you as a speaker in our district, how would we contact you? And when I say speaker, like to train us.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I have my contact information on a slide, but it also could be shared through Dr. Sullivan. So you would just email me. So I have, I'll put my email in the chat for you. But you can email me. I actually have done some specifically teaching on from my book, some professional development with some school districts in Denver, actually. So that's definitely something that I could do and would be willing to do. So feel free to just reach out to me, and then I'll just give you my full name so you will have it too. And I would love to continue the conversation and potentially come out if that's something that your district would like, or you could agitate enough to have them do.
Or by Zoom, because you're actually sitting in Georgia. Also, as Dr. Blank pointed out in the chat, we will be posting with your permission the video. We're able to share the video for anybody who wants tonight's recording.
Yes. Awesome. No, that's perfectly fine.
Thank you.
Can I please quickly say? Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. I'm an international student from Nigeria, and I'm in a doctoral program in education, and I've taken a lot of classes on tracking and a lot of oppressive practices in schools in America, and you kind of give me a good perspective of how these things happen. And so for me, in terms of reflection, I think what I think we should really think about now is how to really confront neo-racism, because it's like COVID, it's like it keeps on mutating, coming up in new forms. And that's kind of the same issue with Africa in terms of colonialism. So they keep giving us a lot of I don't know how to say it now, a lot of policies to deal with racism, yet it keeps coming up in new forms. So I think how to really deal with these things, in new ways will go a long way in mitigating the impact of oppression, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I want to say thank you for being with us tonight. And good, we're getting some comments in here about it being a fascinating talk and being excellent. And I totally concur with the notes put in the chat, and it's been an honor to have you here. And we will also, you've got his email, so if you want to check it out. So you said your book will be out sometime in 2022, so write to him looking for the book too when the time comes, right?
Yes. No, I'm excited, and thank you all so much for having me join you this evening. And yeah, this was a great conversation, and feel free to reach out via email, as Dr. Sullivan mentioned. And yeah, when the book comes out, when I have the actual date of release, Dr. Sullivan will get it and she will be able to share it with the collective community here. So you guys will get first dibs of knowing when the date of release of the book.
You could even send me an email asking to be put on a list to be informed, and then I would let you know when I know. So it's Sullivan with 2 N's. So if you just want to be on a waiting list for the book, you can shoot me an email and I'll put it somewhere in a little spreadsheet for myself and then let you guys know when I know. So thank you very, very much, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Everyone have a good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having this, and thank you, Mr. Fuller.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.